Today in the EU, what makes Alice Weidel the architect of AfD's success?
I very much hope that the AfD does well, and that Alice Weidel does become chancellor. I think that would be very good for Germany, and I think it's very important. I hope that German people unite and strongly support AfD. Go!
Under Alice Weidel's leadership, the German far right has accomplished a lot. The AfD doesn't just sway voters, it now heavily influences the strategy of rivals, including the CDU. It has the backing of ex-Elon Musk. Once just an idea, the AfD now has a human face and undeniable influence, thanks to Weidel. But behind their polished image, the politician leads a multifaceted life, one that could look incompatible with far-right values. Some say there's two different Weidels entirely. So who is she really? And how has she become the leader of the second party in Germany? Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. I'm joined in the studio by Euractiv's politics reporter in Berlin, Nick Alipour. Hello, Nick, and welcome back to the podcast.
Hello, great to be back.
So I think it's time we talked about Alice Weidel. A mix of factors are contributing to her growing popularity among the general public. I mean, you have the fact that she's the far-right pick as chancellor for the upcoming German federal election, Elon Musk's unfaltering support on X. Can you retrace for us, how did she get here?
I think this campaign so far has become the campaign of Alice Weidel indeed. What's good to remember is that she's not new to this. She's been around for a long time. She's been in politics for a long time.
For a decade.
For
right?
a decade, about a decade, more or less, give or take. She's only really stepped into the limelight, though, in 2016, when she first sort of became a TV chat show phase of the AfD. And back then, the media were all like, oh, look at this young woman who's also a lesbian and who is actually now in a far-right, conservative to far-right party. So that was her stars-born moment, but it took her a really long time to become the star that she's become in this election. And when I say star, I mean to the extent that people abroad have really taken note of her, to the extent that she's live streaming on X with Elon Musk.
Yeah.
And so that really is an interesting journey with lots of ups and downs, but mostly ups for Alice Weidel over the last 8 or so years.
And so very interestingly, you write that there are two sides to Weidel, the private individual and the political persona. And as you mentioned briefly already, there seems to be two very different versions of her.
Yes, at least if you read sort of the profiles that are out there, you might get the idea. And again, as I said, when she burst into the scene in 2016, that's what people were wondering about. Here's this woman, and that's sort of her one side, who lives in a lesbian relationship with a Sri Lankan-born Swiss woman, partially in Switzerland as well, who is raising 2 boys with her partner, who's worked at Goldman Sachs, at Credit Suisse, who's lived in Singapore, Japan, and China, who speaks Mandarin, who actually got a degree and did research on China's pension system, all very specific or very technical. And I think it does sort of mess with people's minds and the cliches of the far right they have in their head. Because on the other hand, let's say there have been a lot more moderate leaders of the AfD along the way. And Weidel does not hold back in public when it comes to talking about migrants who she thinks are often criminal and groping and assaulting women and homosexuals. And she's also embraced this very controversial concept of remigration at the party's last conference. So 2 personas that some people find really hard to reconcile.
And how does she reconcile these two versions of her during interviews and, in the press?
Yes, I think she gives a bit of a classic example that far-right parties have sort of tried to establish as a narrative to make themselves seem a bit less ideological and fascist, I suppose.
We are a a libertarian conservative party in Germany. So we perceive ourselves standing in the middle and actually wanting to introduce sane and serious policies, because we see that this country is in need of real reforms.
Which is, we are defending Europe from illiberal influences from other countries, such as the Middle East, such as other religions like Islam. And so Alice Weidel actually said, I'm not in the AfD despite being a homosexual, but because I am a homosexual, or because she feels like other parties are sort of keeping quiet on supposed widespread Muslim assaults on homosexuals, obviously not really thinking about the Muslim homosexuals there are and ethnic minorities, but that's sort of the narrative she has given, which I think from the research we did at least might not be the only reason how those two personas work together.
And so what else is there?
I believe from the sort of really rare interviews she has given and the really rare moments of her showing her some more private sides of her and talking about her private life, which mostly happens in Switzerland, where she lives with her partner, probably because she's sort of less under pressure and, as she would say, being framed less negatively in Switzerland.
Right.
That she comes from a, I would say, anti-government background, sort of libertarian-leaning background with some conservative roots. Her father was one of the Germans expelled from the territories of the German Reich that were in the east, former Poland, Czechia. So he was very sort of a bit revisionist, she told a Swiss newspaper in an interview. And at the same time, they were all sort of very anti-government and critical of the German government at the time. And that has translated, I think, in later years in sort of like a performance-first attitude. So she's really gone into a high-performance career in finance and making money rather than, indulging the left-wing German state. And from there, she sort of moved on from what she's telling that Swiss newspaper that she spoke to. She didn't abandon her criticism of government overreach in the form of the EU amid the Euro crisis in the early 2010s. And that eventually led her to join the AfD, which was at the time a Eurosceptical party.
Yes, she does mention her anti-Euro belief as the main reason she got interested in the party in the first place.
So you see, that sort of I think is part of it. And if you can also imagine her as a really driven woman, an ambitious woman who wants to be something in politics, then you see how she can very easily embrace the sort of radicalism around her if it helps her career. And that has carried her to the top of the party in the end.
Okay, so let's rewind a little. Weidel joined AfD in 2013. In 2022, she stepped up to co-chair of the party, and at that point, AfD's polling had already begun increasing. It got to around 16%. It was about to grow even more. Now it's the second party in the country. So what role has Weidel played in AfD's boom?
So I think for a long time, the AfD has not really been a party that was reliant on specific people. In fact, the party has undergone so many transformations and it has shed so many leaders who all were sort of dominating figures, but then the party just kept becoming more and more successful, even though it shed sort of those previously dominant figures. So what this has really proven for a long time was that it's the idea of the AfD that it seems to attract Germans. So people vote for them because it stands for perhaps something that's more right-leaning, something that's anti-establishment, something that an outlet for their anger at the established parties and the system and the government. So it wasn't dependent on Weidel. However, obviously, Alice Weidel had her sort of played her role in assuring some people who think that the sort of radical wing, which is really ethno-nationalist, some would say it's lapsing into some sort of national socialist revisionist fantasy. People who think that was too radical were probably reassured by the existence of an Alice Weidel in, the party's leadership. And she was indeed, for a long time, especially on chat shows, the friendly face of the party. So you could say that she helped it, certainly. And at this point that we're at now in the election, she is now the party's sole candidate for chancellor. So we're now actually seeing this party go towards an unprecedented degree of personalization with just one leader who's known globally through her chats with Elon Musk at this point. she is indeed now becoming more and more the face of the party, and perhaps also she will be a driver of the success. That she sort of has to prove now that she can sort of turn the party from an abstract idea of resistance into something that's taken seriously, because their leader is taken seriously as well.
And a crucial development in the campaign happened last Friday. Germany might be witnessing the first cracks in more than a 60-year-long firewall against the far right. The candidate Merz said that the CDU would introduce tougher migration measures, even if only backed by the far right. So is migration the first crack in the firewall? And does this, in a way, represent a turning point for Weidel's party?
In a way, I'd say that firewall, obviously, that's sort of like the rule of non-cooperation with the far right that German parties have sort of submitted themselves to. That firewall's been eroded for a long time because the AfD at this point, well, nobody has sort of cooperated with them to that level, but their ideas have actually already made it into politics, and they are now taken up by established parties. So in that sense, migration was indeed sort of the gateway for the AfD to be sort of like more mainstream, to be embraced and accepted. And with round about a quarter of the German population voting or intending to vote for the AfD, it's probably hard to argue that the firewall's all like intact and working. It's not.
Yeah.
But if you will, you could say that Friedrich Merz's proposal was indeed sort of the first actual crack where someone at the national level said, we don't care who votes alongside us for this proposal.
And is it evidence that the AfD is setting the tone of the campaign?
I would say they have managed to assert themselves quite a bit, in the sense that this was also supposed to be a battle between the incumbent Chancellor Olaf Scholz and the CDU leader, the opposition leader Friedrich Merz, and all of a sudden everyone's talking about migration and the AfD. But that's also driven by the attacks that we've seen before Christmas and now recently in Aschaffenburg as well, which were linked to migrants. So the AfD just had to lean back and let things happen. And, there was Elon Musk who intervened and sort of like all of a sudden, everyone's talking about Alice Weidel and Elon Musk and the AfD. So to which extent that was the AfD's genius in setting the tone of the campaign, I don't quite know. But certainly, as it stands, this has driven Friedrich Merz to take this gamble. And I should say that I don't think Friedrich Merz has any intention of actually bringing down the firewall. He's an old school conservative who's very much opposed to any far right parties. I really think that's credible. But you see, the campaign has actually, as you said, developed in such a direction because of the topic of migration and because of the AfD sort of like asserting itself, that it's impossible for Friedrich Merz to ignore the party as he might have been able to do in the past. So he actually had to do this really weird kind of like rhetorical strategy to remain credible on migration.
Mm-hmm. And indeed, the AfD is trailing the CDU in the polls, but all parties have ruled out forming a coalition with the far right. So what does this mean for Weidel? Is she destined to remain a sort of opposition agitator in parliament akin to Marine Le Pen?
I think Marine Le Pen actually had one foot in the door of the French presidency for about a decade now. Her journey probably hasn't concluded yet. And in the same way, I think Alice Weidel can probably take the path of Marine Le Pen, which is just a sort of like step-by-step edging up higher, closer to power in Germany. That is very well possible. For the moment, there's no chance of her becoming chancellor in February. Now, the sort of like crunch moment, if you believe many people from Merz's CDU, will be 2029. If Merz succeeds as a chancellor, if he becomes chancellor, the AfD will have no chance as well in 2029 to get the chancellery. If he fails, there's a big fight between the established parties and everything goes downhill. They might. The AfD might become so strong that it cannot be ignored anymore, as the far right did in Austria, for example.
And we'll keep following this topic as the election approaches. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
This was Euractiv's podcast, Today in the EU. Sound design by Miriam Sáenz de Tejada and Niels de Keokelare. Research and production by Charles Cohen. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news and sign up for our newsletters. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and your favorite streaming platforms. Don't forget to subscribe and give us a review. It will really help us spread the word about our work. See you tomorrow. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.